For many artists out there, you dream of making your own Metroidvania, your own 2.5D platformer. You want to bring your hand-drawn 2D art into a video game. How do you do that? Games like Hollow Knight and Silksong have really popularized this style of game. I myself created Twilight Monk, which is a 2.5D Kung Fu action adventure Metroidvania with a fully explorable 2.5D overworld, and that just came out a few months ago. You can play it over on Steam. It's getting excellent reviews, and I worked on that for about 3 years, and so I know a thing or two about making these kind of games. I was more inspired originally by some of the old Castlevania, the Igavanias, if you will. So Twilight Monk is a little bit more of an RPG, a little bit less of the Twitch action. It's a little less brutal on the combat, I'll say that, than say Silksong or Hollow Knight. But the focus of this video is going to be about how can you take 2D art, your hand-drawn art, put it into a video game. I can walk you through the pipeline. I've recorded the entire process of creating the Twilight Monk game. Let's talk about getting your 2D hand-drawn art into a game engine. The process starts with a concept. You have to do an illustration, you have to do a mock-up of what your final goal is. And what I've done here is I've painted out this desert scene. This was a location that I wanted to have, and it was in the script that I had written. And this was intended to be a very windy kind of a desert space with a lot of like floating palaces and a lot of like creepy underground caverns in an old ruin. And step 2 of this process is to cut out specific parts and then expand on those parts. What you're basically building are the IKEA components. You've got your window for the front of the thing, you've got the legs, you've got the top part, and this is where it's really important for you to do material studies. In fact, if you've watched any of my landscape painting tutorials, you'll recognize these rocks that I did from studies, literally, and then just recolored them and put them into my texture sheet for the background. It's really important, by the way, to reuse a lot of art assets, especially with game development, because otherwise, like sometimes you might be one of 2 artists on the entire game, and there's a ton of stuff you have to make. So it's really smart if you can reuse some parts, and so I use a lot of tricks that I've been using for years to just create iterations and copies and alternates. And so like, you don't want every plant in a background to look the same. Sometimes you want to have the variation. So sometimes you just make a little duplicate and then you make some tiny little changes to that. And sometimes that just sparks a whole little variation. But one thing that I will say, like, is a little pro tip here. If you've got an architectural language or a style, you want to be consistent with all of that across your entire texture sheet. And this is where it's actually really good to have all of your pillars in one big texture sheet or all of your plants in one big texture sheet. You can literally color dab and then make variations and they'll feel like part of the same family. And I've done tons of tutorials as well about building story and building consistency in architecture and storytelling in your environments here on my YouTube channel. And keep in mind, this is going to be also where a lot of that storytelling, like I said, is going to take place. You're going to want, if you've got camping equipment or, there's going to be a little fire pit or, you might even have something as large as a house that's been destroyed, maybe a giant axe fell into the house. What is your story for this environment and your location? You might want to go back to sketching out more of your concepts. Some of my dungeons will have multiple concepts, for instance, this is the barracks part of the dungeon, or this is where they, the torture chamber, the same dungeon, but it's got different props in there. And so you want different areas to stand out, and you want those visual markers too. So this is your opportunity to create the props that are going to allow you to leave those visual markers. And this comes from doing it and then practicing and then coming back and making another texture sheet. You don't get this like right away, but the more you do this, the more you start to realize, oh yeah, I'm going to need some layered parts for all those layers of sand, for example. Now, keep in mind, in the case of Silksong, they probably had, the creative director was doing the paintings, and then they had other employees that were doing those props and the cutouts. If you're just a couple of scrappy indie game developers like we were on Twilight Monk, you got to do everything yourself. But you get into it, you start to enjoy it. You just change out your hat. One day you're concept creative director guy, the next day you're prop painter. So you get all of those pieces. You want to piece them together really nicely, a little bit spaced apart onto we use a 4096 texture sheet. It's 4096 by 4096 pixels. Then you want to save that out as a PNG. Along the way, and I kind of do this throughout the whole process, but I'm going to take you into the next section. So part 3 is actually implementing these texture sheets into Unreal Engine. Now, obviously, there are a lot of different engines that you could choose, but we chose to work with Unreal Engine. So once you import it into Unreal Engine, it's just a texture. You have to make a sprite out of that, and then you have to cut out all of the render geometry to just make sure that it's only showing that one little piece of the huge texture sheet, and then you have to center the pivot point, or the gizmo as it's sometimes called, and you have to do that for every single thing that's on that huge texture sheet. There's a lot of work here, right? And then here's the thing, the most important thing, you got to delete all collisions on your artwork from this. Now, what most people don't realize about a game like Silksong or a game like Twilight Monk is that there's actually no collision on the sprites themselves. The collision happens from a grid of just black tiles that are behind everything, and that's the collision layer, technically, and that's all set to invisible when the player sees it. All of the artwork is just a facade that's made in layers. And if you see the side view, I've shown this many times on my channel, but if you look at the side view of how all of these layers are compiled, they're really just sort of like a shadow box. If you've ever done that when you were a kid, I don't know if you have, but you basically build these layers of depth with flat planes. And that's all that's really happening here. But in those planes, you might have visual effects like fire or smoke or lights. And so you have to manually go in and place some of those illusions of lights everywhere that you want them, or where you want things to be illuminated. Most lighting in a 2D game like this, or a 2.5D game like this, is very fake. It's really just fog layers that have transparency on the materials that create a sense of depth from using value contrast. And you know, this is the part that you just get lost in. You'll see I'll hit the play button to preview. Like, how are things parallaxing? Are there gaps between the sprites? Do I need to go back to my texture sheet and like maybe paint up a variation of some of these sconces or something? You know, like you never know until you kind of see it in practice, and how well some of your textures will tile together. You never really know for sure, and you never really even know for sure exactly which pieces you're going to need. And so I found myself throughout the whole process, I would go back to my original concept again, and I would go, oh, you know, maybe I need to like imply that some event happened here. You know, maybe there was like a torture chamber, and so there's like, you know, torture equipment laying around, and I'll have to add those to the texture sheet, you know. And that's kind of a back and forth thing that you see in this video. You'll see me doing it a few times. But the second caveat I would say is, like, sometimes you got, you know, a tree or something that's swaying in the wind. You don't want 500 frames of animation for that. It's best to use something like a spine plugin, which is sort of a puppet animation tool. And yeah, that just saves you tons of time. Or you can just map it to 3D geometry and then give it weight and get into the weeds, man. It gets very complicated very fast, but this is the basics of it. I didn't want to give you a super deep, in-depth teardown of how every part of the game is made, but hopefully this gives you some insight that you didn't have before. If you would like to see more game development tutorials from me, please do let me know in the comments below, and like the video and sub and all that, because otherwise YouTube just lets me know they don't like those kind of in-depth tutorial type of videos. So I've kept a lot of this video very surface level, but I still think there was some really cool stuff. I'm really glad I recorded the whole process. I got a lot of these for almost every dungeon in the game. And by the way, so here's how it looks in the final game. I have had an incredible career in the video game industry. I've gotten to work on some of the world's biggest video games. I got to do my own indie video game. I mean, what a dream life. I mean, it's been kind of amazing, and I love to pass on my knowledge and experience to the next generation. I've just finished my complete concept art course, which includes 7 tutorials that take you through everything that I know about making concept art for big AAA video games, from creature design to environment painting and the storytelling and all the things that come along with that, and all the things you go through in the kind of companies that I've worked at, like Blizzard and Riot and Epic Games. So you can learn that directly from me for a fraction of the cost of what you'd pay to go to art school to learn such a thing. So check that out if you're serious about making art for video games. So thank you so much for stopping by. Don't forget to check out Twilight Monk. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. All right, ciao.